today. So ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Chris Skinner.
Well, hi. It's quite late over here, but I'm still awake and I still think I'm quite with it. And thank you for the invitation to people who are responsible with their assets, or I assume you are, as that's what the theme is. My children think I'm Iron Man. They think I'm Tony Stark, and I have to explain to them I'm not Tony Stark, because Tony Stark is actually Elon Musk. It's not me. It's this other guy. And I'm much more Bruce Banner, to be honest. And you may be wondering why I'd start with that statement, because when you look at me on this connection via Zoom, I probably don't look so young. I'm not so sure. It depends on the light. But I'm an old dad. I've got two little 6-year-old boys, Eddie and Freddie. Eddie's on the left, as you look at the screen. Freddie on the right. And they think I'm a bit of a superhero because I've raised them that way. But when you have kids, and some of you have and some of you haven't, it doesn't matter. I never thought I'd have any. But when you have kids, you suddenly find it changes your perspective. And so for me, it made me start to think about what's my purpose. And that's been the theme of a lot of the things I've talked about in the last few years. And my latest book, Digital Good, which focuses on what is the purpose of finance? What is the purpose of banking? What is the purpose of the way in which we exchange value? In fact, it's made me question everything. Ask why. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can. Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah. So it's made me question everything. And I've spent all of my life in financial services and technology, and now that's called fintech. And when we question everything, we can start to ask, what is banking and finance here for? Why do we invest the way we invest? What are we doing with our pension funds in the future? Where is our investment taking the world, not just our country and our company, but everything on planet Earth? And it starts to make you think different. In fact, I'll come around to explaining my presentation in a second, but I started with this opening because when you talk about the purpose of finance, and then you add technology, it makes you think different. And that's what's happening with fintech. It's what's happening with cryptocurrencies. It's what's happening with the whole way in which we look objectively at the industry, because we can challenge every part of the industry. By way of example, the internet doesn't recognize the borders of countries. And this is a huge challenge for every government, because basically Earth is not surrounded by borders. We created them. And it's a theme I regularly explore, which is the fact that we believe things are the way they are because we're told it's the way it is. But if you challenge it, you realize it's not the way it is. If you think about it, the Federal Reserve doesn't exist. If you think about it, Fidelity and the institutions, JP Morgan Chase, don't exist. They're just contracts and exchanges of structures that make us believe it's that way. It's not that way. And the internet started to challenge all of the foundations of that way. Time doesn't exist. Actually, it was Albert Einstein who said that. And when I saw that quote, I thought, geez, yeah, that he's right. We invented time. There are not 365 days in a year or 24 hours in a day. We just made it that way to support the contracts and structures that we now believe in. And money doesn't exist. We just invented it. And in fact, there's some very interesting attitudes around monetary exchange taking place right now that question what money is for and why it exists. And the real point of money is not about value, but about values. What is it we value most? Which comes back to purpose, which comes back to where I started, which comes back to life, family, and the journey we take as we go through life. And I'm not going to talk about the meaning of life, because that's a Monty Python film, and the answer is number 42. But when I was growing up and working in the 1990s, I saw a presentation about life assurance, and they said it's learning, earning, and burning, as in the next 20 to 30 years of your life in work, and the last 20 to 30 years of your life spending everything that you've earned during your lifetime. But it's not like that anymore. We're not born creating a family and then dying. We're going through a totally different life cycle. The world does not exist in the way in which you thought it exists. You can question everything. And when I was growing up, learning, earning, burning seemed quite natural. And yet I've gone through several relationships and marriages and countries and situations. I've ended up living in Poland, which actually is a very nice place to live. Fifth largest economy in Europe. In fact, it's the fourth now because Britain left Europe. And in particular, the biggest change during my lifetime, I think, is digitalization. So that's what I'm going to hone in on for the next 20 minutes, and then we'll have some questions, hopefully. In that we've got digitalization, which has created the fintech community, which has led to digital transformation in asset managers, because it's now digital assets as well as physical assets. And then we're going into a new phase, which is post-digital transformation. And I'll explain what these things mean. But let's start with digitalization. The pandemic, I think, made digitalization pretty obvious. And for those of you who worked at home for 2 years, like I did, you rapidly moved into using Teams and Google Meets and Zoom and connecting with everyone on video. In fact, it annoys me these days because everyone thinks that we have to use video to have a meeting, whereas I actually still like a good old phone call. But maybe that's because I'm a Luddite and showing my age again. But we changed our behaviors overnight. One of those things for me was suddenly doing everything online, because my 2 6-year-old boys needed entertaining. So almost every day I was ordering something online and getting it delivered the next day. In fact, one day the delivery guy came by and rang the bell and just said that he wanted to check we were alive because he didn't have a package for us. So, things moved very quickly to a new norm, as the phrase goes. The new norm in finance, I think, is pretty obvious in that when you go out to a restaurant these days in New York or anywhere in the world, everything is on a QR code. You don't get a menu on a piece of cardboard. You get a QR code on a table mat, which you read on your phone and find out what's going on. Everybody downloaded mobile banking apps. In the UK, 6 million people downloaded mobile banking apps in April 2020, which was like a 12% shift in behaviors from old ways of doing banking to a new way of doing banking because of digitalization. And similarly, during the last couple of years, the price of Bitcoin and related cryptocurrencies have gone through the roof and then crashed. So, we've gone through a very interesting time, particularly in the last 2.5 years, from being non-digital to being digitalized to questioning what we're doing. But it's quite clear in this digitalization structure that we now are dealing with money over internet protocol, which, if you remember the days of AT&T and the baby bells in the 1990s with voice over internet protocol, they could never have envisaged that we'd be talking on Zoom or Skype. Who has a landline with money over internet protocol? Which raises this question around who needs a bank account these days? Who needs a financial company when you can do everything peer-to-peer because of digitalization. Specifically, the fintech community have capitalized on, leveraged this opportunity. In the last few years, the fintech community have grown hugely, so that there are now over 160 unicorns. The figures here were from last year, around the world, and I've encountered many of them. In fact, I've been involved with many of them from the start. The first one I met, in fact, was back in 2005. Some would say it was PayPal back in 1999, but in 2005, I was working with a small UK startup called Zopa, who are now one of the unicorns around the world of fintech. And you can see the figures here about how quickly, particularly in the last few years, the fintech startup community has grown to leverage this digitalization, optimization of breaking apart the old system and using the network to create a new system and questioning everything. Why do we do it that way? I think the stunning statistic here, particularly for responsible asset investors, is that the fintech community has gone from a valuation of 3% of financial markets in 2010 to 38% in 2021. Now, we may say they're overvalued, which in some cases I think they are. The valuations this year have gone down. But it is quite clear things are changing. And the main change for me that I see happening is that the fintech community is breaking apart traditional financial structures into automated processes using plug-and-play technology and code. So a fintech startup can take any part of the financial marketplace, retail, wholesale, commercial, investment, private, wealth, and take a piece of that market, just one little bit, and break it apart, automate it into code that's plug and play, a thing called an API, an application program interface, and create a unicorn. My favorite unicorn is actually Stripe. And the reason it's my favorite is that it was created by two brothers back in 2010 under Y Combinator in Silicon Valley. Patrick and John Collison were 21 and 19 at the time. And they're a couple of Irish guys who are incredibly visionary. They've created a wonderful company. But when they launched in 2011, they launched just 7 lines of code. Just 7 lines of code. But it made it so simple for a merchant to drop that code into what they were doing to make it easy for people to pay, that all of the innovators started using it. All of the innovators from Lyft through Kickstarter dropped in Stripe because it's beautiful code. And this is a critical point about fintech and digitalization, that code is art. It's not just code. It's when you, as an engineer and developer, you look at someone who's developed these 7 lines of code, you go, that is beautiful. And that's why everyone used it. And after 5 years, Stripe were valued at almost $10 billion. Not bad for a brand new company. A couple of years later, they've doubled in value to $20 billion. A couple of years later, in fact, only a year later, almost doubled again. And by 2021, valued at $95 billion from 7 lines of code. It's a global network. And this year, actually, the valuation has probably gone down to about $75 billion. So that's a reflection of the drop in the tech markets and the recession that's looming over all of us generally. But if I put this valuation in March last year in context, there are a number of banks that are centuries old, like Commerzbank in Germany, that Stripe, after a decade, had become more valuable than 9 Commerzbanks, or more valuable than 3 Deutsche Banks, or more valuable than a couple of big contexts we're living in, which is like with the internet boom bust. Everyone said when it busted, well, that's that, done. And yet Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Meta, Alphabet, we've seen this massive boom in technologies. And now we're seeing this massive boom in technologies in finance, which is what we call fintech. I'll give you a couple more examples and I'm going to move on. But the interesting things for me is many of the most successful fintechs are in the transactional space, in the payment space. Within the insurtech space, and there's lots of gradients around fintech. So we have insurtech, regtech, wealth tech, and more. Insurance is being really changed. And one of my favorite examples there is a company called Dead Happy. As you can see, Dead Happy. The founder was in his 20s and had a life-threatening illness. And whilst lying on the hospital bed, thought about how he could change his life insurance to adapt to his family's needs, and realized that life insurance contracts are totally inflexible. And that's the reason, because life insurance and insurances in general were invented in the 1700s on an annuity basis, because we couldn't afford to give people flexibility or to see them regularly. So it was like once a year we might drop by and talk to you. And I love the irreverence of the idea of a company called Dead Happy. And when you sign up with them, you can actually sign up for your death wishes and get options about how you want to die and what happens to your money when you die. And equally, you can change the policy in real time, all the time. So when I signed up, I said, send my ashes into space, because like what you prefer. But it's a very different view of the world, because it's using technology in real time to do things differently. Another example is a company called Stable, run by Rich Council. And actually, Rich is the son of a farmer, but he didn't like the farm. So he ran away when he was coming out of university to join the City of London as an investment banker, and then realized that farmers find it really difficult to do hedging and use financial contracts, because they're not designed to be understood by someone who's milking cows. And so he went back to the farm and created a unicorn in the barn of the farm. And what it does is basically, in the app, allows farmers to very quickly hedge the risk of their crops failing that season through a very simple risk contract that's underwritten on the insurance market. The process of doing that is still incredibly complicated, but he's made it very simple, and it's a brilliant startup company. But what I've illustrated between Rich, who's in his 20s, running a billion-dollar company, and Patrick and John Collison, the same, is that they have joined technology and finance in a brand new way. And this, to me, is a really interesting factor around fintech. It's bringing the old to the new. So when I walk into most boardrooms of banks, I'm met with these sorts of guys. And then I go into a boardroom of a technology company, and I'm met with these sorts of guys. So, banking and finance and asset management is no longer about grey hairs. It's about vision and tech. Unfortunately, for the grey-haired old banks, that means a massive challenge around how to change the company to be like a digital company. Because when you're born digital, that's easy. If you are born physical, how do you become digital? And that's the biggest question in every financial institution right now. By way of example, the structure of finance and companies that I've dealt with until recently has been a front office, which is typically a store or a branch, linked to a back office, which is a big head office, via some infrastructure, which is the technology that's completely inflexible and cannot change, because it's been there with a high investment cost up front for the last 20, 30 years or more. And yet now I talk about a world, particularly in fintech, of apps, APIs, and analytics. The apps link all the technology and devices around the world, from cars to televisions to clothes to glasses, via APIs which are plug and play, drop them anywhere with beautiful code, to analytics, which is where the data and the data leverage needs to come in through artificial intelligence. So when we talk about digitalization and digital transformation, the challenge is, how do you move from that old physical structure of distribution through buildings with humans to this new structure of distributing through software and servers. And you can't just do that like that. It takes time. And I've talked to an awful lot of companies about this. And the company that really gets it actually is a company that's pretty new and was born digital, which is Alibaba from China. And Alibaba have this structure of a front office super app that provides commerce, service, and entertainment. So imagine if Facebook, Amazon, and PayPal merged into one. That's what Alibaba is. That's their front office, a commercial, entertaining service company that's providing all the things that Amazon, Facebook, and PayPal could provide. Now, they can only do that because the middle office is all connecting those services through Alibaba Cloud, and APIs and cloud are the most important developments along with mobile to allow this to have happened, into a back office that's all about analytics and payments and risk. And what I love about this slide, and the reason I use it a lot, is that the mother lode of the existing financial institutions is they have this data bank that's built over decades around what customers are doing. And that's where I think the crown jewels are in the incumbent financial institutions. If they can use that data, you can't have artificial intelligence if you've got dumb data. You need to be smart with data. And the reason why this slide comes home to me is if you look at the bottom four layers, and third up from the bottom is a company that deals with digital marketing and data, and it's called Alimama, because Mama looks after Alibaba. That's their joke, but I've stolen it. I went around the world speaking with a lot of large traditional financial institutions, trying to find out how they were dealing with the challenge of fintech and digitalization. And they've got there, but they're getting there very slowly. And a lot of it is based around looking at what to do, spending a year or so going around the digitalized companies that are born digital that they respect, like Spotify and Netflix and others, and finding out how they organize, how they manage, how they structure. And then spending another year or so internalizing that to work out how to do that in their own institution, and then implementing that idea, doing it, which takes a long time. And once they've done it, the thing that some forget is they have to then do it forever. I meet a lot of financial firms that think digital transformation is a project. And as soon as they say that, I know they've got it wrong, because it's not a project. It's actually the whole organization and its culture. In fact, digital transformation's got nothing to do with technology. It's to do with how you think and how the leadership and the organization changes its thinking to be truly embracing digital so that everything can be questioned. Going back to where I started at the beginning of this presentation, question everything. In fact, because I deal with banks all the time, I find a lot of them delegate digital transformation. They think it's a project, they give it a budget. In fact, they create a function called Chief Digital Bankenstein. And Bankenstein is basically where they stitch together all the parts of the organization to look like it's digital, but actually it's only the front bit that's digital, the app. The rest of the organization is still running on awful, scary, legacy, dead parts that they're stitching together and injecting with electricity to keep them alive. And so you'll probably meet a few Bankensteins along the way, and I would suggest you avoid them, because the fintech community is going to bring them down and stop the electricity supply. So just a thought. And in fact, a final thought on digital transformation is during the pandemic, when everything was at home, including employees and organizations and life, I realized the best way to think about digital transformation is if you imagine that all of your customers are on Earth, but all of your organization is on Mars. You structure your organization if that's the way it is. And that's effectively what happened during the pandemic. You know, a lot of us moved to cloud. Did we actually redesign our business to be cloud native, or did we just transition what we had before to be cloud based? And that's the difference between born digital and born physical. It's a difference between digital natives and digital immigrants. You know, a digital native actually really understands intuitively the business model that I've just described around apps, APIs, and analytics, and the structure to be born digital. But to be honest, digital transformation is so last decade, it's no longer relevant, to be honest, because if you haven't done it by now, then where were you? What were you doing? Because the next decade is actually how can we use digital transformation, which is an ongoing continuum, to do good for society and good for the planet. How can we use digital to change to be greener? And this came to me through a lot of things. In fact, it probably came to a head in 2019 when Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO and chairman of JP Chase, delivered a manifesto from the Business Roundtable with 200 signatures from the biggest corporations in the state for stakeholder capitalism. And there's lots of debate around the ethics and ethos of this, particularly around Davos and governments and how we think. But I decided that using digital to do good for society and good for the planet would be an interesting thing next. In fact, it came home to me when I met with a pension fund, and the pension fund manager said, my biggest concern is that by the time that our new customers get to have a pension, there will not be a pension to be had because there won't be a planet anymore. A conscientious objector. And I didn't create my newest book, Digital for Good, to be green. It's actually more because I have a huge concern personally around biodiversity. In the last 50 years, 60% of the planet's wildlife has been decimated and destroyed by human activities, which has nothing to do with climate change. It's just to do with deforestation and you know, the fact that you know, the world is getting warmer, whether we like it or not. That could be a natural cycle, or it could be an unnatural cycle. But I thought it's interesting when I meet a lot of the fintech visionaries who are young, that this is quite high on their agenda, to actually use their company to make the world better and to actually pay it forward, give something back to society. So I reached out to over 20 of my friends around the world to be interviewed and to write about and to talk about how we could use digital for good. It included my friend from Ant Financial, and there's an amazing story in Ant around how they created Ant Forest. It actually was the idea of one employee to begin with, but then a team, and then rolled out. And it's become the biggest multiplayer game digitally worldwide. I think they have over 650 million people playing this game now. And the game is basically, if I spend with an environmental conscience, so instead of driving to work and buying petrol, I catch the bus. Instead of taking a taxi, I bicycle to get to the office. Instead of buying goods that are plastic, I buy them in cardboard. You get points, and points make prizes, and you can steal points off your friends based on your activities. It's an amazing story because at the end of it, the more points you get, you end up planting trees. And they've planted millions of trees across China that's actually, if it's true, would probably decrease China's carbon emissions by about 3 to 5% over the last 5 years. I haven't seen the latest numbers, but it's a fantastic story. I reached out to Gottfried Lieberland, who's the former chief executive of SWIFT, which is the global messaging network for payments and transactions. And he believes that, again, we can make the world a better place and pay it forward by using payments to give offset and structures that focus on how we do things. I've reached out to Anthony Thompson. Anthony is the founder of Metro Bank and Atom Bank in the UK, as well as 8600 in Australia. And our discussion, in fact, was how can we, what is the purpose of banking? How can we make banking and finance work better? I reached out to Brock Pierce, who's the chair of the Bitcoin Foundation, and actually ran for president in the last US elections. And we talked a lot about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, and I specifically asked him, Bitcoin uses more energy consumption than Denmark and the Netherlands combined. And we had an interesting dialogue around how we can solve that and where that's going. I reached out to Gail Bradbrook, who's the founder of Extinction Rebellion, and she's actually really intelligent. People thought when we launched the new book that she would be a radical extremist, and she's actually a doctor with a doctorate and a mother, and her concern is, like mine, that we want our children to have a better world. So I could talk about these things for ages. I'm going to skip over those examples because I'm aware of time, and I think we want some questions. But at the end of the day, the question I always come up with is, we're digitalizing the planet. I think technology is good. I think it is making the world a better place because we can connect like we are today globally. I think fintech is challenging all the ideas of traditional finance with technology and digitalization. And financial institutions are trying to keep up, and 9 out of 10 financial institutions that I meet haven't actually understood it's a complete transformation to be a digital at the core organization. What they're doing is they're laying digital on as a project and as something on top of the old company. And then in the next decade, as I say, we can move forward into making technology something that's leveraged to have a better world. But the last thing is, so what? So what should you do? And particularly as responsible asset managers, what should you do? And one of the questions that came up when I was looking at the new book, Digital for Good, was how do you price an extinction? If we're destroying the planet, which whatever way you look at it, I think we are, but I look at it from biodiversity and the loss of wildlife and the circle of life, because going back to that statement, 60% of the world's wildlife has been decimated by human activity in the last 50 years. The circle of life will stop working. Plastics in the oceans, those are things nothing to do with climate emergency. They're to do with our behaviors and how we invest. I'm meeting many more activist investors these days, pension funds and asset managers, who are saying, I will not support these banks if they are supporting fossil fuels and fracking, for example. Have you made that decision? Because if you haven't, then my kids will never meet Iron Man, except they did on their birthday this year. Thank you.
And don't go, because there might be some questions in the room, but I would just say there were some fascinating insights in there, but unfortunately there were some sound problems, which meant that sometimes it looked like maybe you were drinking gin under the counter, and I know you weren't. So I think that it does highlight our concern. When you talk about digital, we all think about hacking, and we think about things that can go wrong, and we don't know how we can fix them because we don't know how they went wrong in the first place. And we want to give everybody access, but that includes the bad guys. And so when you talk about digital for good, do you recognize that there's also a fundamental fear and a lag in terms of, I don't think I'm that old, but and I use digital a lot, but still, I would hesitate about certain things and making certain investments and entrusting it to this invisible thing out there. Can you see that there is a reluctance, and how do we overcome that when the reality of breakages come down right in front of us?
Yeah, sorry about the sound issues. You also sound like you're talking from the bottom of a well.
Probably, probably.
But basically, yes, there are issues about digitalization and connectivity, particularly when it breaks down. What do you do? The thing about humans is that we're very good at creating systems that can reinforce the network. So I'll give you an example. Both Visa and MasterCard and SWIFT have had breakages in their network, but their disaster recovery and business continuity ensured it came back up again very quickly, because obviously it's incredibly important for that continuity. And we always equate it to flying, which is if a plane crashes once, you're nervous. If it crashes twice, you don't fly with that airline. And so what I see happening is most of what we're building is getting that continuity to ensure that you don't have crashes, or if you do, that the cushion is there to make sure that it's not going to hurt anyone.
So what do we see if we get the book? What will we learn from that we didn't know already?
It depends which book you buy. As I've written, actually 22.
Okay, just the latest one will be fine.
So the latest one is Digital for Good, and what you'll get out of it is over 20 people talking about how they see the world changing through digital transformation and paying it forward. And the 22 people come from all 5 continents of Earth. I would say all 7, but the penguins and polar bears didn't join in.
Okay, it sounds great. Is there anybody else here who'd like to ask a question before I let Chris go? No? I'll let him go back into the TARDIS. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.